Pastor Noel mentioned, we're going to be looking at the 10 Commandments over this summer. And you don't have to raise your hand or say them or anything, but how many of you would be able to say and name all 10 Commandments right now, if I were to ask? Now, they did a survey of this a while back, and they found about 14% of Americans could name all 10 Commandments. Meanwhile, 25% of Americans could name all 7 ingredients of a Big Mac. So about twice as many. And so maybe over this summer, we're going to be spending about 10 weeks with these. I want to encourage you, if you don't know them, you couldn't name all 10, maybe take this summer to learn them, to memorize them, to have them be something that's written in your heart that you can reach to whenever you want, something that you would be able to say, something that's inside of you, not just something that you look up or something that's in a book. That'd be sort of my challenge and my encouragement to you all over this summer. This morning, we're not actually going to be reading any of the 10 Commandments. We're just going to be hearing the story about how God's people came to Mount Sinai, what happened directly before God gives these commandments to his people. So that comes from Exodus 19. You can find that in your bulletins. You can follow along as I read. On the third new moon, after the Israelites had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that very day, they came into the wilderness of Sinai. They journeyed from Rephidim, entered the wilderness of Sinai, and camped in the wilderness. Israel camped there in front of the mountain. Then Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him from the mountain, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the Israelites, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the Israelites." So Moses went, summoned the elders of the people, and set before them all these words that the Lord had commanded him. The people all answered as one, "Everything that the Lord has spoken we will do." Moses reported the words of the people to the Lord. Then the Lord said to Moses, "I am going to come to you in a dense cloud, in order that the people may hear when I speak with you, and so trust you ever after." When Moses had told the words of the people to the Lord said to Moses, "Go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow. Have them wash their clothes and prepare for the third day, because on the third day the Lord will come down upon Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. You shall set limits for the people all around, saying, 'Be careful not to go up the mountain or to touch the edge of it. Any who touch the mountain shall be put to death. No hand shall touch them, but they shall be stoned or shot with arrows. Whether animal or human being, they shall not live. When the trumpet sounds a long blast, they may go up on the mountain.'" So Moses went down from the mountain to the people. He consecrated the people, and they washed their clothes. And he said to the people, "Prepare for the third day. Do not go near a woman." On the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning, as well as a thick cloud on the mountain, and a blast of a trumpet so loud that all the people who were in the camp trembled. Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God. They took their stand at the foot of the mountain. Now all of Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord descended upon it in fire. The smoke went up like the smoke of a kiln, while the whole mountain shook violently. As the blast of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses would speak and God would answer him in thunder. When the Lord descended upon Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, the Lord summoned Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go down and warn the people not to break through to see the Lord. Otherwise, many of them will perish. Even the priests who approach the Lord must consecrate themselves, or the Lord will break out against them." Moses said to the Lord, "The people are not permitted to come up to Mount Sinai, for you yourself warned us, saying, 'Set limits around the mountain and keep it holy.'" The Lord said to him, "Go down and come back up and bring Aaron with you. But do not let either the priests or the people break through to come up to the Lord, otherwise he will break out against them." So Moses went down to the people and told them. The word of the Lord. Please pray with me. God, as in this story, you have called us to stand before you, to be here before you, to prepare ourselves to hear your word. Lord, may we hear it clearly. May we see what it is that you are trying to tell us, and may we understand the closeness of the relationship that you are calling us into. Amen. How many laws are there in the United States? I knew people were going to say that. Too many. Well, we have the Constitution. We have the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. We have 17 more amendments after that. But if you were to add up all the laws on all the books, all the tax law, property law, criminal law, how many would that actually be? There was a House committee that was assigned in 2008 to answer part of this question. They were asked to calculate the number of criminal offenses under federal law. And 5 years later, they responded, "We don't have the manpower or resources to answer such a question. There's too many to calculate." In 2010 alone, 40,000 new laws were added throughout the country. That's in 1 year. Just imagine, the country's been around for a long time. That's a lot of laws. Now, I hope that just kind of helps us have some perspective when we look at the laws that are written in the Bible. In total, the Hebrew Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, contain 613 laws. A measly 613. These were there to govern the moral, the social, the civic, and the spiritual life of the people of Israel. But it was well understood amongst the people that these laws, these 613 laws, could be summarized and encapsulated in the first 10, the 10 commandments, given by God through Moses to the people. Now, these are going to be our focus for this summer, each week looking at a different one. But before we even look at all of them or any of them, we're going to start by asking a series of important questions about the origins of these laws, the scene in which they were given. And by looking at this passage this morning, we're going to ask 3 questions in particular. When were these laws given? Why were these laws given? And how were these laws given? When were they given? Why were they given? And how were they given? So to begin, when were these laws given? When in the story were they given? In what order? Remember what was happening to the Israelites before this. They had just spent 400 years as slaves in Egypt. Now, the word freedom was not in their vocabulary. Generations of Israelites were restricted and confined by the rules of cruel slave masters. And they were brutally punished whenever they would step outside of the commands that these slave drivers were holding over them. But then the Exodus story tells us about how God intervened. It says, He heard their cries, which in itself is good news, isn't it? The God of the Bible is a God who hears the cries of oppressed people. When we are in our deepest pain, when we're in trouble, when we are enslaved by something or someone that is preventing us from living the life that we're called to live, God hears, God sees, God intervenes. God sent Moses to bring his people out of slavery, and the Egyptians, they were overpowered when God acted, and the people were led out of Egypt up to the edge of the water at the Red Sea. And then when Pharaoh's armies came out chasing after them to bring them back into slavery, God parted the seas, made a way for his people to pass through on dry ground. And as the Egyptians chased them through to bring them back into slavery, once all of God's people were safely on the other side, the waters closed back in behind them, engulfing their enemies and bringing God's people into safety. After this, God led them through the wilderness to this special mountain, to this holy place, and it's here that he gives them the law. Now, what do you notice about the order of these events? Now, when did God save his people, and when did he give them the law? The order of these things is really important for us to notice. Now, did God send Moses to the Israelites and say, look, here's these 10 commandments. if you will listen to these commandments, if you can make yourselves holy, if you can be obedient to my words, then I will free you from these slave drivers in Egypt. If you can obey and follow the law, then I will free you. Is this what God does? No. It might be what we expect, that God would ask for obedience to these commandments, and if we obey, then he will free us, then he will welcome us in. But that's not what the story says. The story tells us that God saves first and then gives the law. The God of the Bible isn't some demanding figure looking down to see who is being moral enough to deserve his help. He sees the people that he's chosen in Israel. He sees these people who are small and weak, this community of slaves, and he intervenes for them, and he rescues them, even though they haven't done anything to deserve it. He brings them out of slavery into freedom, and then he gives them the law. Not as another kind of restriction, like the laws that they were used to, but actually as a way of enhancing their freedom. God works to free his people, but he also shows them how to live as free people. He knows they're going to need some guidelines, some instructions on what it means to live as people who are free from slavery. God gives the law in order to help a people who are already free stay free, to live freely. And that's how God works for us too. God sees you when you're trapped. God knows when you suffer. And the gospel tells us that even though we don't do a thing to deserve it, God comes to us in Jesus. He makes a way for us to also go through some important waters, the waters of baptism, and then on the other side find freedom and a new life. And it's after this saving experience that we receive God's law as a gift, as a guide to help us know how to live as people who have been freed from a former way of life that kept us trapped and enslaved. Now, this is when they were given. The law was given after the people were freed. Now, why were they given? Well, we've already answered this in part. These laws were given for the purpose of helping a freed people stay free, for helping a free people live freely. Now, this might seem counterintuitive at first because we often think of laws as things that restrict our freedom, as if they're there to confine you, to limit what you can do. They shrink freedom, is what we often think of when we think of laws. We think of the thou shalt nots and the finger wagging and the things that prevent us from doing what we want. But think about it for a minute. When do you need restrictions? When do you need to stick to something narrow? Now, I know there was a jam session the other night where a lot of musicians and people who help lead worship at River Rock got together and played songs together. Now, in order to do that well, everybody needs to confine themselves to play these songs on the same key, at the same tempo, and at the same-ish volume. If everybody said, I want to be free to play what song I want, in the key that I want, and on the tempo that I want, would you be able to create, what would you make? You could not make good music. You would just make this noisy mess. It's by confining ourselves to staying on the same beat, to playing in the same key, to playing the same song, that we're actually free to create beautiful music. Or think about this. I've shared this story before, so forgive me if this is repetitive, but years ago, I was going for this hike up to Twin Lakes in Desolation Wilderness. If you've ever been up there, it's this beautiful hike. It's this path that follows a stream up to these two lakes way up in the mountains. And it was incredible. There was a lot of snow melt that year, so the stream was gushing and the waterfalls were just, towering over each other. And the snow-capped peaks are beautiful. And I went up, and it's one of my favorite hikes in the whole Tahoe region. Hung up my hammock, had my lunch, and it was time to go back down. But going back down the mountain was a little bit of a different story. Because there was so much snow melt, there were multiple streams heading down the mountain, not just the one that I followed on my way up, the only one that was on the map. And so on my way down, I'm following a stream and think I'm going the right way, only to suddenly realize this was the wrong stream. And half an hour in, I find myself in the middle of the wilderness, not sure where to go, completely in the middle of nowhere, just surrounded by trees, brush, scrub, open granite face, and I did not know what to do. Now, in that moment, I could go any direction I wanted. I was completely free and uninhibited. I could go this way or that way or this way or that way. I could go back up. I could go down. I was completely free. The whole world was before me. I could blaze my own trail, which, isn't that the American dream? No rules, nobody telling you where to go. I could go anywhere. And it was terrifying. I hated it. It was an overwhelming sense of freedom. It's the kind of freedom that is actually what it means to be lost. What I needed in that moment was to be confined. I needed a path. I needed a narrow strip of dirt that would lead me through the wilderness. You think about it. If you're there in the wilderness and everything's wide open, it sounds so freeing. While being on a path, it's narrow. It restricts your movements. You cannot go this way or that way off the path. A landscape with no restrictions, no path, is a wilderness, not a place where you can live and survive. After wandering and stumbling around for about an hour, I saw two hikers in the distance, and I went running up to them and caught up to them, and they must have thought that I was crazy, but finally got back on the path, and I swear I could have knelt down and kissed the ground. I was so happy. I loved that narrow and restricted, confining path. I loved it. I was so happy to have it. When I was lost, I was free to go any direction that I chose. But really, it was only the narrow and confining path that could give me the freedom to go where I really needed to go, just to go home. Psalm 119 says, I run in the paths of your commands, for you have set my heart free. That verse has taken on new meaning for me since getting lost. When you're out in the scrub and the brush and you're lost, you can't run. There's too many bushes, too many trees, too many things in the way. But when you're on the path, you can run. You're free to actually go faster, to go further, to go where you want to go. That's what God's law is to us. These laws are given to enhance and expand your freedom, not to diminish it. Make you free to run, free to live the way that you're meant to live, free to live in a way that leads you where you want to go, instead of the endless, boundless freedom of being in the wilderness, which is really just being lost. Now, our final question of how did God give this law? What's going on at Mount Sinai? What's happening in this long story that we read? This story that's kind of confusing and kind of scary and kind of intimidating. Moses, he's sure getting his legwork out on this day. He's going up the mountain to talk to God, and he's coming down the mountain to talk to his people. He's going back up the mountain to talk to God, and he's coming back down to talk to his people, and he's going back and forth as this mediator between God and the people of Israel. And all of this this is happening. And this might seem like a strange analogy, but I think the best way for us to understand what's going on here in Exodus 19 at the foot of Mount Sinai is the lead up to a wedding ceremony. This is where God and his people are going to enter into a covenantal relationship. They're exchanging vows. They're expressing their love for each other. They're establishing their commitment to each other. God says to them, I bore you out of Egypt on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. If you keep my covenant, you will be my treasured possession, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And the people say back, everything that the Lord has spoken, we will do. But then something interesting happens. God says to them, great, here's how the wedding ceremony is going to go. I want you to prepare yourself, get cleaned up. This is where God says that line, don't go near a woman, which sounds a little odd to us. But think about it. The Bible, it teaches us that sex is an act that unites people heart and soul. It's a way of putting your heart and soul in the trust of another person. And God is saying, in a short while, I'm going to ask you all to put your heart and your soul in my hands. So for the next 3 days, don't go near a woman. Now, this makes sense. And then he says to them, after you're all ready, once you've gotten cleaned up and you're prepared for this covenant, I want you to come to the foot of the mountain, and when I blow the horn, I want you to come up and be with me on Mount Sinai. God is asking all of his people to come up this mountain and be close to him, to be with him on this holy mountain, this touch point between heaven and earth. He's saying, when the horn sounds, come up and be with me. And so on the third day, the people are ready. They go to the foot of the mountain. God comes down in this terrifying scene of fire and thunder and thick black clouds of smoke. It's like they're standing in front of Mount Doom. And God's glory has come down to earth, and it's this sight to behold. And then the trumpet blasts, and nobody moves. They stay there. It goes out of its way, this reading, to say the trumpet blast got louder and louder, and still nobody moves. They're just watching this in fear. You see what's happening? It's as if you're at a wedding ceremony and the music starts playing. Here comes the bride, and she stays there. She doesn't come down the aisle. She doesn't come close to her soon-to-be husband. The people are terrified. So Moses goes up the mountain again, and he enters into the smoke and the fire and the thunder and the shaking mountain, and he speaks with God on the people's behalf. And God says, look, the people aren't coming up, and I want you to get your brother Aaron, and I'm going to do this ceremony with you guys standing in for all the people. And that's how the chapter ends. In the next chapter, we get the 10 Commandments. Now, how is the law given? Well, it was meant to be given to all the people. But the law was given by means of one man who went up a mountain into a terrifying scene that looked like certain death. He stood before God on behalf of his people, and it was through him that a new way of life was opened up to all the people who were too afraid or too ashamed to approach God themselves. And you see what's happening here? This is no longer just the story of Exodus 19. It's not just the story of Moses and Israel. This is the story of the gospel. This is the story of Jesus. This is the story of you and me. When we are too afraid or too ashamed or just unsure whether or not we can approach God directly, Jesus goes up to be our mediator. He goes up on our behalf, and he went up a different mountain. He went up this hill outside of Jerusalem, carrying a cross with him, into a scene that looked like certain death. There's darkness and there's clouds that day outside of Jerusalem. But unlike Moses, who risked his life on behalf of his people, we see Jesus goes up this mountain and gives his life on behalf of his people. And 3 days after his body was put in the tomb, we see Jesus rose again, and now we say that he stands before God the Father as our intermediator on our behalf, and that through him, a new way of life is open to all of us. We see that Jesus calls us to follow him along this path. That, like the Israelites, we might be afraid to approach this holy God, this God that feels powerful and maybe scary and intimidating. But we follow Jesus up this mountain into a space that looks scary, that can even look like certain death of clouds and darkness and fire. And by following him up this and into that place, we come into God's presence, a place that we can stand with Jesus as our mediator, who brings us to be in that direct relationship with God, to walk down the aisle in the way that the Israelites didn't, to stand before God, before Jesus as our bridegroom. That's how the Bible describes him, as a groom, and the church as his bride. And we're called to walk down that aisle. The gospel is the good news that we've been freed from slavery to sin and death. And it's after that freeing action that the law is given, is the outline for how to live as free people. I'll end with this. Remember how we said that all 613 laws of the Torah could be summarized in the 10 Commandments? Well, Jesus actually, he took that a step further and said that all of the 10 Commandments could be summarized in just 2 laws. The two greatest commandments of love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. If you've been freed in Christ, then obey these commandments. Live these commandments, and in doing so, you'll be staying on the path that allows you to live freely. God's law, God's commandments to us are freedom enhancers, not freedom restrictors. Let's pray. God, we thank you for calling us to be with you, for sending your son Jesus to be our mediator, to stand before you when we were too afraid, and also to make a way for us to come to you as your bride. God, that you would call us, though we've done nothing to deserve it, to enter into this covenant relationship with you, to be your people, to join your family, to be a part of your home, to live as those who are called by you and claimed by you. Help us to recognize that in ourselves, that we are your people, that we have been freed, and that now as free people, when we ask, how do we live as free people, we look to your law and your commandments as a guide, not as something restrictive that we must slave over in order to earn your approval or your happiness, but as something that you've given to us as a gift, saying, this is how to live as the people that I have freed. This is how to follow the path that allows you to run, where being lost before this just kept you in a type of freedom that's truly confining and bewildering and leads nowhere. Help us to follow your paths and live as those who can experience the enhancing freedom of your law. Amen.